Before I start this story, I'd just like to let you all know that I'm predominantly a skeptic, or at least I was until this house. I actually rarely talk about the events that happened in there because I don't have any rational explanation, but that house has stuck with me well into adulthood. Back in 2009, me, my mom, and my stepdad moved into a really old, rustic, rural cottage in England. My father had passed away not too long before, and this was going to be a new start for us all. The house was an absolute bargain. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 very spacious living rooms, and a huge annex at the back that was essentially a second house. We couldn't work out why it was so cheap. We went for the viewing, and the family eventually told us that there was an elderly mother who had passed away there peacefully in the annex, and they just needed to get away from the feeling of her. That probably should have been the first red flag. We weren't put off, and we bought the house. From the off, it was unsettling. My parents didn't see it at first, but I was incredibly uncomfortable. It was extremely unnerving and cold, and not to mention, it was isolated behind rows of trees and a very long driveway, so far from anyone else. It started on the first night. My room was the one at the end of the corridor, and if you came out of my room, on the right was a bathroom and a locked door that had led to the annex, the place where the elderly mother died. My parents slept a long way down the corridor in the last bedrooms, so I was quite isolated, and directly opposite my room were the stairs. The first night, it was freakishly cold. I pulled my blankets up to my head, but after my dad passed away, I had suffered from insomnia for years, so the cold and the anxieties of moving to a new house all added together with this into zero sleep. So I ended up laying awake for hours, just sort of staring around the room. My bedroom door was one of those old and mismatched wooden country house doors. Didn't quite reach the carpets, and after a few hours, I could hear the creaking of floorboards directly outside my room, and shadows that seemed even darker than the darkness of the hallway walking past my door. I presumed one of my parents had gotten up to use the restroom at first, but this went on, back and forth for several minutes, and it was fast, a very brisk walk. And not to mention, next to my door was the locked door to the annex. Anybody walking at that speed would have hit the door, but nothing. It freaked me out, and it had me dreading the next night. This kept happening every night for weeks, and I remember vividly one night I actually left my bedroom door open. Around the same time I heard the creaking, I turned around, and unmistakably there was a figure, blacker than black, walking forward and backwards in front of the door, just visible in the darkness of the hallway. I couldn't take my eyes off it the entire time it was there. It's safe to say I never slept with the door open again after that night. But this is where things start to get properly creepy. I'd been terrified of this shadow for weeks now. There was a really horrible feeling I had around it, like it was after me, and one night, as I was going downstairs for dinner, I had the same cold feeling, and for just a second, I froze in place in the dark hallway and looked to my right towards the annex door. And there, sure as anything, and without my sleepy eyes to blame it on, I saw the same black shadow walking directly at me at a high speed. I ran downstairs as quickly as I could and told my parents everything. They mostly laughed it off and didn't believe me and tried to reassure me that ghosts aren't real and there was no chance of anything about this old lady. still being in the house. Now, a bit of backstory. This old lady was terrified of the previous owner's family dog, so much so that they had to install a pulley system in the house so she could pull a cord from her bedroom that would trigger an old bell to ring in the kitchen if she wanted anything. The whole system was still there when we moved in, and this night, the night after I told my parents, I was awoken around 2 a.m. by this bell in the kitchen ringing loudly and on repeat, like it was being pulled firmly and constantly. I ran out into the corridor, and my parents were there too, equally as confused and concerned as I was. We all looked at each other with ever-increasing worry and ran downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on. As soon as we entered the kitchen, it stopped. We ventured up into the annex to see what could have caused this, but nothing. No sign of anyone, and my God, I hated it here. It was even colder and more lifeless than the main part of the house, and I just felt like I needed to leave as soon as I could. My parents didn't quite believe that this was a ghost yet, but they were clearly less skeptical than before. From here, any activity became much more obvious. We, my parents included, started to hear knocking from the annex door next to my bedroom. Noises from downstairs that sounded like someone was down there, moving. Sometimes my fish tank light would flick on and off with an audible click and wake me up, and I would often wake up to my wardrobe doors being swung open with no breeze in sight. One night, I was sat reading alone in my room, and one of these wardrobe doors opened by itself, wide and with relative force. I got up cautiously, closed it, and ran downstairs to see my parents. When I came up around 15 minutes later, every single cupboard door, around a dozen of them, were open as wide as they would go. Lots more went on too. Taps turning themselves on became a particularly regular occurrence, and one night, I awoke to the sound of my cupboard door opening again and saw droplets of water running from the bathroom next to the annex door all the way to a few feet from my bed, with no droplets out again. I was terrified. It was around 6 months after all of this started that we eventually moved out. My grandma had begun to grow unwell and couldn't care for herself anymore, and she moved in with us. From the beginning, she hated the house. My grandma was so incredibly sweet and calm, and I've never seen her distressed like she was when she was there. And on one night in particular, when I was sat downstairs in the kitchen with her, she took my hand, pointed directly towards the annex, and said, "Don't you go in there. I don't like it in there." It's safe to say, this scared the crap out of me. On the last night we all spent together in that house, I was awoken by my mom screaming. Clear as day, she said, she felt 2 hands firmly grab her ankles over the bedsheets and pull her down the bed just a few inches, and right then and there she asked to leave. We went to stay in our old house for a while, but because of size, my stepdad, the biggest skeptic among us, stayed in Lilac Cottage for a few more months. He's still quiet to this day about that house. He hates talking about it, but even he admits that there was something incredibly wrong there. And without much warning, he put the house up for sale, selling it so desperately that he lost almost a quarter of the price he paid for it. He's never told us why. I've promised myself that one day I'll reach out to the current owners of that house and see if they have also experienced anything, but I haven't just yet. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. All names in this story have been changed for privacy. For some context, I live in a major city and currently don't do a lot of driving due to the ongoing issues with my car. Plus, the pandemic has made me turn to more delivery apps in general. So, the other day around 1 p.m., I decided to order some lunch after doing a lot of cleaning. I placed the Ubereats order and found something to watch while I waited for the food. Within a minute, a driver accepted the order, and I noticed right away that the driver, Anthony, was on a bike, didn't have a profile picture, or any deliveries on record. At first, I wasn't alarmed at all. I was almost amused, like, oh wow, I guess I'm this person's first ever customer. But then, a full 30 minutes passes with no driver movement on the app, and at this point, I think maybe something is glitching out, or the driver is stuck. I contact support via the chat option, and they end up assigning a new driver because they couldn't reach the first one. Odd, but whatever. Now is when it starts getting a little weirder. The new driver assigned is in the exact same spot as the original driver. They are also on a bike, and have no profile picture, and have no prior deliveries as well, and this driver's name was Lori. I let another 20 minutes pass with no driver movement before I messaged them myself and say, "Hi there, are there any issues with the order?" The app shows that the driver saw the message, but no response. All this time, I'm checking to see if Ubereats is maybe experiencing issues. None that I could find. And at this point, while I'm definitely weirded out, I'm mostly just hungry. So I contact support again to request some assistance. They reassign the driver again and apologize for the inconvenience. Same deal. They also tried to contact the driver with no response. Finally, the third driver assigned is the exact same scenario. Same spot, on a bike, no profile picture, no prior deliveries. Only this time, the name is Robert. And before I can react and go about canceling the order, because at this point, I'm just tired of dealing with this, he suddenly has my food and immediately messages me the following.
"Hello, have your food. What's your phone number?"
And I respond right away with, "I'm not super comfortable giving my phone number out when you can just message me here." And he responded again with,
"What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?"
And at this point, the alarm bells are going off, and I contact support immediately to have the order canceled and get further assistance. I get connected to Uber's safety team, who informs me that the order has been canceled. I'll be refunded, and started taking down the details of the strange interactions. As I'm giving the woman on the phone the info she needs, I'm starting to calm down, thinking this was just some creep or something. And that's when I hear a man's voice at the front door.
"Miss Metal Gear 42069, I have your food."
And I can't even describe the chill that went down my spine because of the way that he said it. Making things even worse, the Uber safety woman on the phone with me heard him as well and says, "Is that him? We canceled the order." I poked my head around the door. Main heavy door was open. Metal screen door was closed and locked, but allowed us to see each other, to get a good look at him. And when he saw me on the phone, he went from smiling to looking furious. He suddenly got right up against the door and kept asking who I was on the phone with. And at this point, I've started asking him to please leave because he was making me uncomfortable. And he's getting more and more angry, and at this point, starts pounding on my door and grabbing at the doorknob while shouting to be let in. The woman on the phone is asking if I'm okay. The man is still shouting, so basically, I'm in full meltdown mode at this point. and hurriedly closed the heavy door to lock it. The man is becoming borderline belligerent as he kicks my door, and the woman tells me to call the police. He ended up walking away from my house about a minute after that and back up to the sidewalk, and for a moment I thought he had effed off, so I finished up my conversation with the Uber safety woman so she could submit the report. Once she submitted it, I called the police and told them exactly what happened. They weren't incredibly helpful at first, since he didn't actually break in or put his hands on me, and they told me if he came back to call again, and they would send an officer out. I did end up having to call them again and give a full report, plus description of the man, since he didn't end up leaving right away. He stayed in the neighborhood for almost 20 minutes. According to one of my neighbors, after she heard the yelling, she saw the man I described walk back up from my house to the sidewalk and hop into a truck with another man in the passenger seat, and they apparently just sat there, staring at people walking by and being incredibly sketchy. And that's when she walked back towards my house and asked me what had happened. Luckily, she was able to give myself and the cops a full description of the vehicle and the other man as well. So, basically, this was a very bizarre and uncomfortable experience, and I wanted to share it to maybe see if anyone else has ever had an experience like this, because honestly, I'm still pretty shaken up and will be avoiding delivery apps for quite a while. So, strange Ubereats driver who asked me for my personal info and then proceeded to try and break in. Please, let's not meet. I recently shared this story for the first time in a True Scary Stories group on Facebook. I got a lot of feedback from people who lived in the same town I did when this event happened. It felt good to finally share my experience. Shortly after posting, a woman contacted me and physically threatened me and my family if I wrote about him again. She believes him innocent, etc. It spooked me. I took my story down. I don't need weirdos like her in my life. I've since done some thinking about this and wanted to post my story again somewhere anonymously. It's my experience, and I'm not going to let some crazy child killer dater bitch scare me. So, here it is. I originally thought this incident happened in January of 1984. I now realize it was probably later in 1983. I was 8 years old and lived in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb southeast of Denver, Colorado. We lived in a brand new subdivision, and I loved it. Our house was busy. I had 3 older sisters, an older brother, and a grandmother, and my mom living in our house all at the same time. My 10-year-old sister and I shared a bedroom on the main floor. Our house was a ranch style. I loved this room. My twin bed was pushed up against the wall, and I had a window that faced to our backyard. I liked to push the curtains aside at night and perch my elbows on the windowsill and look outside. The window was elevated, but not so high that I couldn't see into the yard easily. My older sisters shared the room next to us, and my grandmother was in a large room across a small hallway from us. My mother had a finished bedroom all the way downstairs in the basement. My brother had the rest of the basement. He was 16 years old at the time and had a lot of friends that were always coming and going. I remember our house always being full of guests. We had a really cold spell hit us that week. It was super icy out, and my sister and I had been playing in the backyard. Our backyard had not yet been enclosed with a fence. We had these circular snow sleds that we would stand on and glide across the slick parts of the grass. We weren't good at putting our outdoor toys away, and had left them strewn across the lawn. That night, something woke me up out of a sound sleep. I thought about getting up and going downstairs to sleep with my mother. I did this from time to time as she and I were really close. Then I heard a noise outside my window. It sounded like someone was slowly walking across the snow in the backyard. I could hear the frozen grass crunching underneath their feet. I then heard someone say,
"Shit."
or another explicit word, and something clink. I perched up out of bed and moved my curtain aside and looked out the window. I think I originally thought I would see my brother or one of his friends out there. He often came in late at night, past curfew, and usually snuck through the backyard into the open basement window. I remember thinking that he shouldn't be doing this on a school night, and I was going to tell my mother in the morning that he woke me up. It wasn't my brother. I saw a young man, probably in his early 20s, that I didn't recognize. I made eye contact with him and then quickly scanned the rest of the yard for my brother. I didn't see him anywhere. I was going to move away from the window, but the man's eyes were glued on mine, and he started walking towards my gaze. I froze. I couldn't move. He came as close as he could to the glass. He smiled at me. It was an eerie smile. It was a, "Oh look, you caught me doing something I shouldn't be doing," kind of smile. I remember he had crystal blue eyes, almost gray. Something about his expression was not right. It took me a few seconds to realize I was feeling fear. He was not a friend of my brother's, nor supposed to be in our backyard at that time of night. I panicked and jumped off my bed and quickly ran downstairs to tell my mother. Once I got to the basement, I saw that my brother was sound asleep in his bed as well. This scared me more as I knew now for sure that this man in our yard was most likely not a friend of my brother's. My mom calmed me down, came upstairs, and turned the light on outside and looked in the yard from the sliding glass door windows. She didn't see anyone. I remember her not making a big deal out of it, and I ended up sleeping in the basement bedroom with her for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep well. I wondered why that man was in our yard and where he went. I remember feeling scared he might come back. I don't know the exact timeline, but I am guessing it was a few weeks later that a family a few streets over from us was murdered in the middle of the night by an intruder with a hammer and a knife. The father, mother, and 7-year-old daughter were killed, and a 3-year-old daughter was left for dead, but miraculously survived. This crime sent our entire community over edge. The police did not seem to know who had done this horrible thing or why. All we knew was that the hammer killer probably chose their house at random, came in through an open garage door or something. No one in my family mentioned to me the man I saw in our yard again. I asked my mother about it years later, and she tensed up. The hammer killer case went cold, and the community moved on, as people do. I moved further south, to a different side of Denver. I never forgot that man in my yard, though, and always felt he might have been the same man who murdered that family. As years went by, more information came out, and they linked the murder of the family to a vicious murder of a woman in another community, Lakewood, as well. They also linked him to a savage attack on a couple and a flight attendant in Aurora as well through DNA. He was a serial predator, and he was active in our community that entire time. Fast forward to 2019, and I'm watching the news. I can't believe it. They have solved the cold case of that family's murder from 1984, as well as the other attacks. They flash the picture of the suspect across the screen, and my heart stops. It's him. It's the man I saw as a child. I have that face saved in my memory because he spooked me so badly. I said something about it to my brother, and he shrugged it off. I mentioned it to some friends, and they said it was creepy, but there was no way that I could have remembered something like that. I thought they might be right, until the news also showed some photos of the suspect when he was younger, and likely committed the murders. That is exactly the man I saw. I know it. It's changed the way I think about things. It's changed the gratitude I feel for life. What if he hadn't tripped on our sleds in the yard and somehow made his way into my house? My sisters and I could have been the ones on the news that night. When my son was 2 years old, he started acting as if he was interacting with something or someone that his father and I could never see, like throwing toys down the hallway and then running and murmuring words. When I asked what he was doing, he always told me that he was giving toys to the boy for him to play with. There was never anybody there, but it was always icy cold down that hallway and leading into the garage. I'd ask him what the boy's name was, and he would tell me Dawn was his name. I asked what the boy was doing. Waiting for his mom to pick him up, he would always reply. We put it down to an imaginary friend and nothing more. Harmless, we thought, until he started waking up in the middle of the night, screaming, saying, "Dawn won't let me sleep. He keeps tickling my toes." This sent chills down my spine, and so my son would sleep in bed with me every night. This continued for another 6 months, until the real estate agent notified us that the owner of the house had died, and his children would be selling the property and splitting the profit between them, meaning we had to move. After we left, I came across a local news article about the owner of our old rental, stating how much he will be missed by the community. He had been raised by his mother in the house we were renting since he was a child. Then, I noticed his name, and everything came flooding back to me. His name was Dawn. My son's imaginary friend was our home owner. He must have been waiting for his mother to come and take him to the other side. I'll never look at imaginary friends the same. This is something that happened to me a couple years back that still freaks me out when I think about it. To start with, this was around midnight, and I was in my room browsing stuff on my phone when I suddenly hear what sounds like knocking outside my ground-level bedroom window. I first shrugged it off as being a squirrel or something, until I heard the same sounds again, which is when I started becoming concerned. It was at this point that I left my room and called my dad to tell him about what was happening. He tried to reassure me it was nothing, and while this was happening, I heard even more knocking coming from around the front door. I tried calling out to see if it was my brother or anything, but I didn't get any answers. At this point, I was starting to really freak out. It was after this that I heard someone at my back door trying to force the door open. It was locked, thankfully, and finally, after this, my dog finally caught on and started barking like crazy at the other end of the door, which finally drove whoever was out there off. After that happened, I called my grandpa, who lived a block over, to come and pick me up because I was way too scared to be able to stay the night in that house. In retrospect, I should have called the police, but I wasn't thinking straight, and I was shivering on the couch holding a kitchen knife the whole time I was waiting. I still have no idea who was out there that night. I had taken a walk alone in a nature trail earlier that day, and my only working theory is that someone had followed me home. I later learned that there were drifters living in the woods around that era. This was probably the scariest experience I've been through, and it still makes it hard for me to stay home alone at night. This is a true story. My grandma's house was built over an old city dump, which was cleared out and built over in the 1970s. God only knows what kind of supernatural energy they stirred up ripping this place apart. Her house never felt right. You would always feel watched even when you knew you were alone. Random stuff would appear out of nowhere. I have always wanted to take a metal detector and run through a yard with it. You would see shadows in the corner of your eye all the time. Stuff would vanish, move, and then appear months later when you knew that nobody had touched it. When I was around the age of 5, I met my imaginary friend by the name of Billy. Why I put that in air quotes is because I don't think he is imaginary. Billy is a bright little boy. He looked to be around the age of 8 or 9. I think he is from the 1950s. He wears a yellow checkered shirt with a pair of blue overalls. His brown hair was always slicked neatly to the side of his face, and he has blue eyes with freckles. He kinda looks like a young Sheldon. The reason why I don't think he is imaginary is because, 1, he only lived at my grandparents' house. 2, my sister saw him too, even though I had never mentioned Billy to her. 3, I saw him until I cut contact with my grandmother at the age of 12 due to her narcissistic behavior. Billy would tell me that he was going to marry me when I grew up. He would hold my hand, kiss me, and play with my hair. He even gave me a ring that I still own. Whenever I would mention Billy to my parents or my grandparents, they would tell me that I was imagining things. Billy and I would always play together. His favorite game was hide and seek, but Billy would play dolls with me as well. He would play anything I asked. As I got older, I would normally just talk to him. Sometimes we would play games, but it wasn't as often as it was when I was younger. Of course, Billy didn't age. Despite me growing older than him, he still was focused on marrying me. When I would ask him where his parents were, he wouldn't say anything. He would often just look at his shoes or tell me he didn't want to talk about it. In fact, he would do the same thing whenever I would ask him about anything involving his family or home life. I once asked him why he was here. He told me he died in a brutal way and that he couldn't move on. He didn't tell me anything more. When I asked him how he died, once again he stared at his shoes and he told me he didn't want to discuss it, so I left it alone. The last time I saw Billy, he told me that he wasn't going to see me for a long time and that he might visit me in my dreams. Fast forward 2 years later to last night. I saw Billy in my dreams. He gave me a hug, told me how much he missed me, and told me that I had gotten bigger. We had a conversation that I cannot remember. He finally told me that his dad had killed him and disposed of his body in the old city dump that was cleared out to make room for the construction of my grandparents' house and the surrounding neighborhood.